Hello and welcome to Timeless with Julie Hartman Live. It is Tuesday, October 8th, 2024. I'm Julie Hartman, and it is great, as always, to be with you. For many of you, this may be your second time hearing me today as I guest hosted for Dennis Prager this morning. A video of that will be up on my YouTube channel. I interviewed, among other people, Batya Ungar Sargon, who wrote an excellent book called Second Class about how the United States has largely abandoned the working class people of America. And we had such an interesting discussion about how a lot of working class people, regardless of their party affiliation, Democrat or Republican, actually see more eye to eye on issues than you might expect. She said that many, for instance, want more health care, less immigration. Many are very supportive of Israel, and at the same time, skeptical about our involvement in Ukraine. And as the 2024 presidential election is less than 30 days away, I really encourage you to go back and watch that interview with her. She went all around the country for a year interviewing working class Americans, and it was really fun to talk with her. 844-861-5537 is the call-in number, 844-861-5537. And as always, you can use the live chat, which Sean McConnell over there in the producer's dungeon will be monitoring. Speaking of a fun conversation, I'm very excited to welcome today someone who has been listening to this show since I began. He's been a very great supporter of mine, which I'm so grateful for. It is Tracy Lee Simmons. Mr. Simmons is a journalist, humanist, and author of prize-winning material, including the book that we will be discussing today, which I recently finished, called Climbing Parnassus, a new apologia for Greek and Latin. Just as indicated in the title, it's a defense of the power of learning the dead languages, as people call them, Greek and Latin, and then more broadly, knowing about the profound contributions of ancient Greece and Rome. Mr. Simmons was an associate editor and contributor to the National Review for decades. In fact, since 1993, he studied Greek and Latin literature and philosophy at the University of Oxford, and he spent a decade teaching at Hillsdale College. And since COVID, Mr. Simmons tells me that he's been helping to pull people out of America's failing public schools and help them become better situated in private schools, or better yet, even homeschool alternatives. So we're very happy to welcome Mr. Simmons to the show. Greetings.
Greetings to you. Glad to be here.
Well, as I told you, I really enjoyed your book because although you state that it used to be self-evident how important it was to learn about Greece and Rome, it is not exactly self-evident today. For people who really don't know very much about our ancient predecessors, what would you identify as the main contributions of Greece and Rome that we still see in our American life today?
Well, look at the architecture of Washington, D.C., for one.
That's right.
And the look of banks and the look of older banks and institutions. Look at the architecture of college campuses that are older than 50 years old. You see visible signs, but of course the most telling contributions of Greece and Rome are really locked in our language and our thought, even in our assumptions. So the old formulation of Jerusalem and Athens really promotes this idea that Western civilization is built upon both. Those are the twin pillars, Athens, of course, standing for Rome as well. And Jerusalem standing for the spiritual foundations of civilization. And for many centuries, people who went on to learn anything more than the rudiments were going to learn the two languages, and some went on to learn Hebrew as well. It wasn't enough just to read the Bible, just enough to read the Greek plays and the Roman histories and so forth. You had to learn the languages too. Now, I don't believe it's necessary for us to learn those languages. That is, for everyone to learn those languages in order to be considered educated. But we've gone so far away in the last 50, 60, 70 years from that standard that I would like to see it reinstituted.
Your point about architecture, I think, deserves some attention because people tend to dismiss the contributions of Greek and Roman architecture to our civilization. And I actually maybe fully didn't appreciate them until I traveled this summer to 7 countries all around Europe, including formerly communist countries. I actually, at one time when I was in Italy is not one of those formerly communist countries, but it was ruled obviously by a fascist dictatorship for some time. I went to Eure, which was Mussolini's fascist dictatorial haven. And I actually I went there on a personal field trip. And as it happens, I then went to a wedding and I was next to someone who is part of the Roger Scruton Legacy Foundation at your alma mater, Oxford. And they invited me to come speak, which I did that next week at Oxford about architecture. And I said, when you go into, these old communist buildings in Romania and Hungary, or you go to Eure in Rome, you feel so dehumanized. You feel so small. And it is designed that way. The scale is very oppressive. It's brutalist. It's heavy. And when you walk into the Capitol, for instance, in Washington, D.C., I don't know how much our politicians are feeling this anymore, but I know when I've walked in there, you become a more ennobled version of yourself because the architecture brings that out in you. And so I'm so glad you brought up that point because we as Americans just dismiss the role that our surroundings play in our character and our behavior.
Right. Well, Lewis Auchincloss's novel called The Rector of Justin, about a New England headmaster going through several generations. And the book is a set of letters and journals really viewing this man's life and his significance. And we see the point early on in the novel that boys, this was a boys' school, are affected by architecture, even though they may not notice it. So it's not quite a subliminal matter, but it's close to that. Our surroundings affect us. If we're surrounded by beautiful things, we judge ourselves by other standards. It's not always possible for everyone to be surrounded by beautiful things, but that doesn't mean we have to make ugly things. And when we look at so much of modern culture and certainly American culture, the last several decades, the buildings say something about us. The fact that they're not really meant to be anything more than used. They're not meant to be looked at. But we see signs of a return to better, higher architecture.
It's certainly true about the degradation of architecture in American cities. Now I see our buildings with my eyes of having gone to Eastern European countries and seeing the remnants of communist buildings. And I'm very disheartened to see some of the new projects afoot here. You, as I mentioned, studied not only the Greek and Latin languages, but you also studied history, literature, and philosophy at the University of Oxford. And I'm curious if you'd be willing to share with us some of the wisest stories or lines in stories from great works of ancient literature.
Well, that's awfully hard to do.
Sure.
It's hard to sum it all up. It's really a cumulative effect. Now, if one reads Plutarch, which you can easily do in English, he was originally in Greek, but though he was living certainly in the Roman world, that is simply replete with examples of great men of that period, of a 1,000-year period, who really put, in a sense, their culture and their countries first, who had their own flaws. These were not perfect men, and Plutarch makes sure we know that they were not perfect men. So they lived within the bounds of their own nature, their own human nature. But what classical literature and classical history has certainly taught us over the centuries since they walked among us is that it is possible for people to live good lives, even if those are not perfect lives. Human nature might not be perfectible, but it was improvable. And we are the sum total of our choices. And you just go back to Aristotle's Ethics to see that. That's one of the great books of the world. It's not the easiest book to read, but it's not the hardest either. And I've seen a lot of people with no training in philosophy who have made their way slowly through it. There's a famous story of Winston Churchill, who never read Aristotle's Ethics. I'm talking about the Nicomachean Ethics. And someone gave him a copy when he was a fairly young man. And he read it. And the fellow asked later, well, what did you think of it? You didn't say anything about it. And he said, well, isn't it all obvious? What is there to say? Everything this man said is true about the nature of the human heart, the nature of human choice, the nature of friendship, the nature of happiness, the nature of virtue. Everything that's there, it simply seems to me still true because human nature has not changed.
That's right. You know, it's such a tragedy in the modern age that many people in my age group, but I'm 24, do not read the Bible or do not read great works of literature. And the first time that I ever read the Bible, if you can believe it, Tracy, was actually when I encountered Dennis Prager and his Torah commentary, because it was positioned as essentially a helper's guide, a way to rationally explain the Torah. And I was blown away by how relevant so many of the stories were to my life. Here we have the first patriarch, Abraham's wife, is struggling with infertility. We have brotherly strife between Cain and Abel. I love the line, for instance, in the Cain and Abel story when God says to Cain that he killed the bloods of Abel. In other words, that he didn't just kill Abel, but the subsequent generations that would come from him. I had never learned such wisdom like that until I encountered Dennis. And one of the things that I took away from your book, which I wish so many more young people understood, is that this is a road to a more fulfilling life. You lament and I lament the practical takeover of education. If it's not useful and it's not contributing to your career or some, effect that you can easily measure, then it is not worth learning about. So much of what is worth learning about does not fall into the useful category. You have this great anecdote in your book where there was some student I remember who was carrying Homer or some other ancient in his bag, and he came to work, and somebody said to him, "What's the use of carrying Homer in your pocket?" And he said, "No use, thank God." So with this takeover of this usefulness takeover of the education system, when did that start? When do you judge that we shifted from wanting to help people accumulate wisdom and understand life to this practicality bug?
Well, it's an odd bug to catch, isn't it? Because what is more practical than virtue? What is more practical than living a good life? The idea that education involved acculturation. The Greeks had a word for that, paideia, that is now used in all kinds of other contexts. But it's the essence of acculturation, becoming part of a culture. The idea that we come into this world out of our mothers completely unformed. We're blank slates, of course. But we have to become members of a thriving society and of a thriving culture and of a thriving civilization. And it takes a lot of work to get there. It starts with our parents, who get us past the first couple of years, without whose help we couldn't survive. They give us everything we need. But then around 3 or 4, they start doing other things for us, like saying, say thank you. And uh, a headmaster I once knew said that it takes boys about 5,000 times saying, say thank you, before they'll do it on their own. Girls, it might be more like 1,000. So boys are being the recalcitrant ones as usual. But the old notion was that in education, we're involved in a very arduous activity, and it's supposed to be hard, because coming out of ourselves is hard. And that we've certainly lost. Now, in the more pragmatic sense, where did this sort of thing begin? Well, it began, you talked about my alma mater, it began at your alma mater at Harvard in the 19th century. I think it was Dr. Eliot, President Eliot, who really began what we now call the elective system. The essence of which is to say, let young people follow whatever they want to do, course by course. Now, obviously, that's not possible. If you want to be a medical doctor, there are certain courses you're just simply going to have to take. If for no other reason that medical schools are going to be making sure you did. They'll be looking at that on your transcripts. But in the humanities, particularly, that approach has done tremendous damage, because the old idea was that these may not be the things you want to read, but these are the things you should read. You should be exposed to them. And they will make you not only more knowledgeable, but probably wiser too. I once thought of a good thumbnail definition of wisdom is that which is true, whether we wish it to be or not.
Yes.
Whether we wish it to be or not. And so we have knowledge, we have information, and of course there's wisdom on the top of all of that. And of course, T.S. Eliot had that great line in a poem, where is the knowledge we've lost in information? Where is the wisdom we have lost in knowledge? Which is simply harking back in the 20th century to an old hierarchy. So education was always supposed to have something to do, not just with knowledge, but with wisdom. And that started to break down in the 19th century. It's not completely gone, but it's on life support.
I had never considered that you could go to school to learn about life. I know that sounds like a travesty, but I just didn't view my education that way for so long, because that's not really the way it's packaged to students. It's very interesting what you say about the shift to allowing students to take whatever courses. When I was a senior in college, I don't know why I did this when I was a senior. I think it's because I was finally awakened to the fact that these were the courses I ought to take. But I enrolled in 2 of Professor Harvey Mansfield's courses about early modern thought. And those 2 courses were the best courses I ever took at Harvard. And I think about them on a daily basis. And I read Nietzsche, who is so difficult to read. I mean, you say that learning Greek and Latin is hard. I would contend, I've never learned Greek or Latin. I would contend that reading Beyond Good and Evil is far more difficult. But his contention that right now, or in the modern world, what we're seeing is, he would call them, I think, internal elements of Christianity. I would call them perversions of Christianity, but celebration of weakness, celebration of victimhood and suffering, radical equality. I mean, I can't decide whether he's in some way brilliant or perhaps quite devious, maybe both. But it still stands that every single day I'm so glad that I have that scaffolding to better judge the world. And truly, I often wonder, what if I hadn't pushed myself to take those courses? My understanding of our country, of our world, would be so diminished. I don't know what I would replace that with.
Well, you see what you did. You took two courses that look to be completely theoretical and not useful at all, and yet you've been using what you learned in those courses every day since.
Yes.
Again, that's about as practical as you can get. You're using what you've become all the time. And education is not just about what you know, it's about what you become. It's about the kind of person you become. There's education in the narrower sense of schooling, but then there's the education in the sort of Henry Adams sense of the education of Henry Adams. That is the formation of the guy who became Henry Adams. Well, he was a fancy guy, but all of us have our educations. We're all formed somehow. What we learn in school, of course, is just part of it. And I certainly don't contend that a classical education, which is what we're talking about with a Greek and Latin based schooling, I would never contend that that would give you all you need, because that's just Athens. You need Jerusalem in some sense as well. You need that wisdom that comes from, I guess, what we would call revelation, not simply what was gained by the poets and by the philosophers and by the historians. And generally speaking, at classical education, the world I was arguing for in Climbing Parnassus is not the world of classical scholars. The world, I don't know how many more classical scholars the world needs. I'm glad they're there because I got to learn from them. But classical education is not classical scholarship. I'm not concerned so much about the people who learn these languages and all they have to give, and then go on to become classics professors, teaching the same thing. I'm concerned about the people who then go on to law school, who then go on to medical school, who become accountants, who become teachers. Those are the people that form culture a good deal more than scholars of any kind. And what we now call classical education has become a kind of specialty. That is, those languages have become a specialty. But they used to be a possession held in common by almost everyone who went to school up until about 1900. And to defend President Eliot at Harvard, who I believe was a chemist, but God bless them, we need them as well. I think one of his arguments might have been, well, we don't have to take these young men into Harvard and keep the languages going because they've already had them, which probably they did. They got it at Choate, they got it at Groton, they got it at all these other places. That they went to Milton Academy, the people who would have been attending Harvard at the time. So there's an argument there. The point is that they would have, those young men got the classical education early in their lives. And really my book is not directed to colleges or college students. My concern is with K through 12. College students who haven't learned very much still have many ways to keep doing so, if they have the will and the desire to do it. But it's really the lower grades where the magic happens or it doesn't. One thing about American public education as it has evolved, because it used to be such a great system, but it's now sort of institutionalized time wasting. And
such a good way to put it.
Well, and you see that in a lot of private schools. A lot of private schools are aping the same thing. It makes you wonder what goes on in these places. So a lot of homeschoolers now, and I've gotten to know a good deal of those, and particularly in the last 10 years, when I wrote that book, I wasn't expecting to see this rise in homeschooling. I had heard of it, I admired it where I'd seen it, but I thought, well, this is always going to be one of these small cottage industries. It's not really going to make much difference. But the last figures I saw, post-COVID lockdown figures, indicate that 11% of young people are now being homeschooled. Wow. Which means that their parents are in complete control, depending on the state's laws, over what children learn. And when I wrote that book, there weren't a lot of self-help books for learning those languages. But now there are not only a plethora of books, but there are many online academies that people can attend now. And so we have an entire generation of children now, not all of them obviously, but vast numbers, many thousands, who are learning the ancient languages, they're learning ancient history, they're learning things that their parents did not get when they were in school, say in the 70s and 80s and 90s. They are now getting what their parents missed. And it's a way of going back to an earlier time. I'm the child of Depression, World War II parents. I certainly got what they didn't get. That's the way it's supposed to be. You're supposed to improve with generation upon generation. But in the last 50 years, we've gone the other way. And now we have children who don't know certain things that their parents still do know, that they at least had to learn when they were in middle school and high school. It's just part of a large movement back to sort of the classical tradition, the classical mindset of learning from the past and not simply denigrating the past. That's all some young people ever learn to do with the past. You know, the assumption is that they're superior to all those people. All those people believe stupid things. That's all they know. And those people have had their souls more or less systematically destroyed by having teachers and other such people encourage that kind of thinking. There can be no joy in that life. I think it was Chesterton who said that the real test of happiness is gratitude. And when you're not grateful for the culture you're living in, and yet at the same time presuming to perfect it because you have now adopted some sort of ideology, that's a very dangerous thing. I think it's what Goethe called ignorance with spurs on. And there's nothing more dangerous than ignorance with spurs on, ignorance with arrogance. Ignorance can be a fairly neutral thing. It can even be innocent. But when it's arrogant, it's dangerous.
It's a great line. It's incredibly arrogant today. You know, you mentioned that American education used to be good. That is a shocking claim to many listening. When was it good? What were the components of it that made it good? I once learned, for instance, that we used to have a character education. And then when did it turn, and why do you think it turned?
Well, probably very slowly after World War II, when everyone assumed that this booming economy would need more practical people.
Interesting.
And why make school harder than it needs to be, right? The idea being, because the idea was that school was just about what you walked away being able to do. It wasn't even what you walked away knowing. So why did people still learn history during this period? Well, because everyone always had. And I guess we have to keep history in the curriculum, but if it's going to stay there, let's make it an altered version of history. Let's try to settle scores with the past. Well, there's a lot of imperfection to be seen in the past because it was full of people like us. And yet at the same time, there's greatness. And if you're going to see only one side of that ledger, you're going to be making a tremendous mistake. But it's not just an intellectual mistake. I think it's a spiritual mistake. Now, you ask when it changed. I was thinking when I was in high school in the late 70s, early 80s, I guess. All public schools that I knew of had Latin.
Wow.
All of them. Now, they didn't require it. There were certain private and Catholic schools that required it, maybe for at least a couple of years. But it was there in every public school. There were usually three languages: Latin, French, Spanish, Latin, French, Spanish. And in certain parts of the country, German would be there too. All great languages, all important languages. But Latin fell out pretty early into the 80s, I suppose, as a course that would even be offered. I hear that there are some public schools trying to bring it back, but I don't know how that would work with the teachers unions and so forth, because there are all kinds of obstacles that will be thrown in that path, because it's too traditional, it's too stodgy. And yes, it is traditional, and yes, it is civilization sustaining. And if you have a lot of people who essentially feel no debt to the civilization in which they grew up, they're going to have no desire to hold on to the higher and the better things.
To close, you talk about how learning Greek and Latin is a boot camp in precision and in logical rigor. You also say, as we've been discussing, that it teaches you perspective and respect for historical precedent. And a gateway into language is a gateway into a fuller life, especially with Latin, because Latin is the basis of so many other languages. You referenced a quote by Sir Richard Wynne Livingstone that intrigued me about Greek. And he said, quote, that the Greek language is capable of feeling and expressing the most delicate minutia of thought. Sometimes I hear people talk about, I have a very dear friend, for instance, who speaks Russian, and we'll be chatting sometimes and she'll go, oh, there's such a great Russian term for this person or this activity. I wish I could translate it. In fact, she was referencing someone the other day who was vibrant. And she said that there was this great adjective in Russian to describe someone who is vivacious and vibrant and full of light and life that can't really be translated into English. Of course, it's difficult to do translation, but I'm wondering if you could give an example or two of some of those Greek words or some Greek aphorisms or Latin aphorisms that capture some of the parts of life that perhaps our language isn't able to.
Well, paideia is, I gave that word earlier. The idea of acculturation that starts with childhood. Of course, the old breakdown would be that 50% of our language comes from Latin, 30% from Greek, and 20% from Anglo-Saxon and other such, say, Germanic type languages. The great thing about the language, you almost have to learn them to know what they give you. But yes, I mean, there are all kinds of aphorisms that we mainly translate. For instance, the idea of moderation in all things, that's an old Greek idea. The idea of gentling human nature in some way or other. These are Hellenic ideas, they're Roman ideas, and Greek and Latin particularly, are what you might call compressive languages. You have a good friend who knows biblical Hebrew very well. That's another compressive language. There are so many things that can be contained in one or two Hebrew characters. I only took a bit of Hebrew, so I cannot claim to be a Hebraist. But I learned enough to know that Hebrew also carries such a freight in such small packages of these words, of these phrases that have not only gone into the bloodstream of our minds, but into the bloodstream of our hearts. So I would encourage anyone to start learning the languages. You need the formative influence for children, of course, but people of any age can start to learn them. I know many people who have done it after a lot of hesitation.
Well, it's actually quite fun. I have a old textbook that my dad had. He was a Latin scholar in Philadelphia growing up, and he really wanted me to learn Latin as a child. I regret that I didn't. But sometimes I will look and just try to learn individual words, and you see that the roots of Latin words are the basis for so many of our words in the English language. And dare I use an overused term, it's very empowering to actually decipher a part of an English word that you may not know because you know the root. But in any event, it's a worthy endeavor to study the contributions, at the very least, of Greece and Rome, certainly the democratic contributions of Greece, the way that Rome, the Roman Empire, demonstrated the way to incorporate other cultures and other wisdom into their own and adopt the measures undertaken by foreigners if those ideas were better. These are things that were central to the American ethos that we have completely forgotten. So thank you for defending them and trying to resurrect them. And thank you so much for your time today coming onto the show.
Great pleasure to talk to you, Julie. Thank you.
And I want to end by telling all of you about something that will benefit your lives in addition to learning Greek and Latin. I'm laughing, Sean. Usually I'm so much better. I know he's giving me a thumbs down. Hey, I thought yesterday when I said let's talk about something lighter, we were talking about heavy things and then pillows, that was pretty good. This, not so much. All right, My Pillow. You can get a low price on the standard classic My Pillow for only $14.88, but it gets better. For a limited time, My Pillow is offering their entire classic collection at wholesale prices. You can get a queen size My Pillow for only $18.88, upgrade to a king for only $1 more. You can get body pillows. That's right, My Pillow has body pillows for $29.88 and multi-use My Pillows for only $9.88. Just go to mypillow.com, use the promo code Hartman, or call 1-800-566-6745 to take advantage of wholesale pricing for the first time ever. And on top of that, get free shipping for orders over $75. Again, go to mypillow.com or call 1-800-566-6745 and use the promo code Hartman to get the standard My Pillow for only $14.88. That's the lowest price ever. Thanks so much for being here, and be sure to tune in tomorrow because I'm interviewing Bill O'Reilly about his new book on the American presidents. There are so many cool facts. I was actually just reading it a few hours ago in between guest hosting and Timeless, and I was communicating with Sean over there. Did you know, for instance, that one president's grandson married that president's vice president's daughter? I know, keep up. Hey, you think learning Greek and Latin's hard? Try to keep up with that. Dwight Eisenhower's grandson, David, married Julie Nixon, Eisenhower's vice president's daughter. Did you also know that a woman tried to assassinate a president and missed a president by a few inches? There was a female, Sarah something, who tried to assassinate Gerald Ford. Sarah Jane Moore. Did you also know that Gerald Ford, like President Bill Clinton, that was not those two names were not their birth names. They took their names from the men that their mothers married, not their biological fathers, because both of their biological fathers were abusers. So just fascinating facts, and I will be sharing them with you. And if you want to ask Bill O'Reilly some questions about the presidents or any of his other books, you can join the chat tomorrow. We look forward to seeing you then. In the meantime, you can always email me at julie@julie-hartman.com. Take care, everybody. I'll see you soon.